those who are able to be the example and really inspire others to shoot higher and to be better are those who walk the walk.
Welcome to Evolved Radio, where we explore the evolution of business and technology. I'm your host, Todd Kane. This episode is brought to you by Evolved Management Training Courses, a whole series of courses built specifically for your MSP training needs. There's a Project Management for MSPs course, an MSP Service Manager Bootcamp, MSP Security Fundamentals, and an IT Documentation Done Right course. Check out the full suite of courses at training.evolvedmgmt.com or look for a link in the show notes. Today on the Evolved Radio podcast, I'm joined by Matt Call, Assistant Professor of Management in Mays School of Business at Texas A&M. Matt's research seeks to understand how organizations can create and capture value from its workforce, with particular interest in star employees. His work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal and numerous academic journals. We chat about identifying high performers, the downside risks of high performers, and how they should influence our thinking about stars as managers as well as members of the team. It's a fascinating and practical discussion about how we increase collaboration and cohesiveness of our teams and the importance of social psychology in the workforce. Matt, welcome to the Evolved Radio podcast.
Thanks for having me, Todd.
All right. So this is a fantastic topic for today. I think we'll just launch straight into things. Your area of research, and especially some of the content that you've been looking at, research that you've been doing lately, is around managing star employees, which is a really sort of fascinating area, and one area that I think doesn't get quite enough attention in the management sphere. I often find a lot of people tend to spend too much time, maybe in my opinion, kind of working with the problem children of the organization, and maybe not enough time on the stars, where I think the majority of the time probably should be spent. So we'll probably get into that a little later as well. But first off, as a lead-in, just give us a bit of your background and then lead into how you identify star performers. Star employees, how do you sort of qualify that, or how would you identify them, I guess?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me, Todd. My background is I'm a research professor at Texas A&M University, and I teach classes in the management department at business school. But my research really does focus on kind of these employees that are special, right? That, I think it was going back to who was an economist, Pareto, who talked about, I think he noticed in his garden that there were, certain pea pods or something that were the ones that were producing all of them. And it came up with this idea of the 80-20 rule, like this
Pareto principle.
Or something like that. Yeah, I don't know.
I use this everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the idea that 20% of the whatever create 80% of the output, right? And so, there's been a lot of work that's shown that across different contexts and that this is kind of true, that productivity is often distributed, not necessarily normally, but kind of outpace these outliers. So my most recent work, and kind of the way in which that we connected over this Wall Street Journal piece that I wrote that kind of summarizes the literature and kind of my work on it, is really kind of not only about how to manage them, but how they impact their peers. And that's often really the thing that people identify with. You think about when we work with a star, sometimes we're inspired. Sometimes we want to, they make us more ambitious. They make us aim higher. We learn from them. But other times we kind of hate them. We kind of think, well, they don't deserve where they're at, or we kind of just, it's not psychologically fun to be around someone who's way better at us and things, right? And so, what leads to those different kind of outcomes, and how do we understand that? As well as, one of the big parts of managing stars as well is understanding that the stars themselves have kind of some uncomfortable kind of social kind of things they have to deal with. They're victimized a lot, right? People who do well have to try and navigate a situation where other people are uncomfortable with their presence or with their performance. And so those are things that I'm interested in terms of research.
All right. So yeah, good summary. How do we identify, I think everyone sort of has an opinion of this, and I'm sort of curious of your perspective, obviously, because in your research, how would you identify who is the star performer in an organization in order to study their effects, I guess, right?
I think there's two different questions here. One is, how do you identify a future star? And that really is the $1 million question, right? And the other one is kind of what we would say is, after the fact, what does a star look like? And my research is often doing the latter, right? But I think understanding who a star is can also help you, once you codify that better, can help you understand who's going to have the potential to be those. So I would conceptualize stars as, first of all, having kind of high performance, right? So them being on an outlying kind of on the tails of the distribution in terms of their performance. But I actually personally think there's a difference between someone who's just an individual contributor, somebody who is a high performer, and a star. I also think stars have a couple of other elements. And in particular, I kind of talk about this as a certain amount of awareness and I call it social capital, right? This goodwill among others, this idea that they are also viewed visibly as somebody who is good, right? So it's not just they're in their basement, producing and killing it. They also kind of have this confidence of their peers and a reputation that kind of has important kind of consequences associated with the fact that they're well known, right, is also a part of being a star in my mind. And some of that, how do you become that? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with your ability to navigate social relationships, your ability to show forth authenticity, your ability to learn how to gain the trust of other people and the favor of other people. So, for lack of a better term, I actually like there's something in the applied psychological literature called political skill. And it talks a lot of it's kind of emotional intelligence, but it talks about this idea of how to come off as sincere and authentic and how to navigate social relationships such that people kind of want you in their corner. And so I would argue that stars have performance, but that's kind of like a necessary but insufficient condition to be a star. I think a star also has these other qualities that make them visible and make them kind of consequential in ways that high performers, they are high performers, right? But that regular high performers who don't have these other elements of visibility and kind of social capital make them more consequential.
I think this is a really interesting insight. So for two reasons. One, like you said, like the political impact or the social impact with the rest of the team is consequential. I think that's a good way to put it. But I think there's also the sort of the identification of and their recognition of their own skill and whether or not that's in line with what they feel is either being recognized or supported or valued in an organization. And I see this a lot, especially in the technical industry, where people sort of lean on competence a little too heavily. And they're kind of technically a bit of the asshole in the group, but they know that they're incredibly good at what they do and they feel like that should be enough. And they're like, well, what do you want from me? Like, I'm doing all of this, like everyone relies on me. Like, why do I have to do X, Y, and Z? And they feel like that almost gives them a pass in a certain way, right?
Yeah. Well, and that only kind of reinforces this kind of already psychological hesitancy or kind of dissonance that people are experiencing around them because of their high performance, right? Their high performance, the deviation from the norm in performance makes others uncomfortable. Sometimes even their leaders uncomfortable, right? And because of the way it makes them look, right? And so you already have this presence that makes others nervous because it points out their lack of performance. And then on top of that, you have this tendency towards, what you're talking about. And it only reinforces that. It gives me a reason to not like you, right? Because he doesn't work well with others. He's this and that. And I think oftentimes, star employees, in quotes, get this rap because of this kind of negative cycle. And one of the things we talk about, and I often focus on is stars have different levers. If you are well, first of all, so let me kind of back up and address what you're talking about. The classic thing is, especially in a lot of professions, technical professions, is you promote the best whatever. And they suck at being a manager, right?
Yep.
And so that's just something that happens all the time, right? And all of those excuses and reasons why are you asking this of me? And I'm just doing my job. I'm teaching them how to do their job. They don't know how to do their job is this kind of common thing. But in order to get to be, and I would argue those people are still kind of high performers, right? And that's how I conceptualize them. People who become stars, I think, rise above that because of these other elements, these other soft skills that help them navigate that. And there are certain things that we actually have found, characteristics of that stars display, that make them less threatening, right? And if they can look into those and learn and recognize, hey, people are going to have a hard time around me. So let me help them navigate that psychological uncomfort, right? And help them to see, look, knowing me is actually a good thing for you, right? If I'm the star, helping them to recognize, because I think in a certain sense, if they can kind of see that working with the star as an opportunity instead of a threat, all of a sudden you get into this world where people want you to succeed, even though you're way better than them, et cetera, right? And so you have to help them to overcome that.
So, what do you see as sort of the difference in this around? I think soft skills. Touching on that was definitely what was sort of ringing in my head around the difference that's here and the difference that makes. Because what I see a lot of cases is that star performer or the high performer on the team, like, hey, you're really good at your job, I'll promote you and you become a manager. And what people and leadership often don't recognize is promotion to management is a career change more than it is a promotion unto itself. Because you're like, what made you successful in your individual contributor role almost has very little to do with what makes you successful as a manager. So I often sort of advise people that looking for the more administratively minded, like organized and social member of the team that isn't necessarily the best individual contributor, but actually has those soft skills is probably a better pick for the leadership of the team. Does that sort of align with what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that those who are the best individual contributors that cultivate these skills would be the best, right? Because then they also have the confidence. Then they can also kind of, what we call them is peer spillovers, those who are able to be the example and really inspire others to shoot higher and to be better are those who walk the walk, right? And they've seen this, they have a reputation, everything they're saying is backed by it, right? I mean, yeah, of course you have people who are good managers and not necessarily great at their job, but I still think there's going to be some sense of, lack of respect, right? For those people. But no, I agree with you. I think I'd rather have someone who was above average at their job with good managerial leadership potential to be a leader than an outlying individual contributor who is horrible at managing.
Yeah, because the other half of this, I almost feel like you're sort of stealing from the productivity of the team if you take the highest performer and try to make them management. So in a lot of ways, it's not sort of the best idea. Plus, like as you said, it's a bit of a unicorn situation. If the highest performing member of your team is also the most capable, like that's amazing. But I don't find that that's often the case. Like they don't often run together. Like it's certainly out there, but they're an edge case in my mind, I suppose.
They could be, but it's interesting because most of the executives that I've worked with and seen, CEOs and et cetera, always have this kind of, I think in the media, this kind of reputation of being jerks and hubris and whatever. But to be honest, my personal experience, which isn't a ton, but they're usually these stars. They usually have done great things and they usually actually have fantastic leadership skills. They remember people's names. They're extremely smart, but they're also extremely emotionally intelligent as well. And so yeah, they may be somewhat unicorns, but I would argue that most people who end up getting to the top do have both in some regard, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's true, right? Because like the selection process to become an executive of, say, a large organization, Fortune 1000 or something like that is pretty grueling, right? It does filter out for the unicorns, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Just one piece that you touch on there, like this is a bit of a tangent, but I have a bit of a fascination with this topic is the difference between sort of a celebrity CEO and a really sort of high performance functional CEO. Like the classic example that you kind of noted is the asshole CEO. And I think Steve Jobs jumps to mind as sort of the shining example of this, of like look at what he accomplished and he just didn't give a shit and treated people poorly. Like that's not necessarily why he was successful. And I feel like folks like Satya Nadella or Tim Cook, for example, like those people don't necessarily get sort of the same recognition because they're not flashy and they don't appear in the industry, right? I think Elon Musk is another example of this, of someone who got a lot of credit and was recognized as a celebrity CEO, but maybe for all the wrong reasons. And I feel like we should switch a bit of this to the idealization of more sort of productive and impactful CEOs rather than the flashy ones. I don't know, side comment, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be curious.
Yeah, no, I think there's several reasons why we become enamored with individuals, and not all of the reasons why we want to hear or are fascinated by people are because of their good traits, right? I think there's part of us, it's that whole Freud, right? We like to see people's weakness at the top. We'd like to, and it makes us feel better about not being at the top, right? And that's part of why, right now it's it's fun to kind of hate Elon Musk and be like, well, yeah, he's ruined Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. I mean, I don't even have an opinion on it, but so I don't know that we can, and the news cycle kind of perpetuates what people like and what people click on, what people listen to. And I think, in a lot of ways, we do know from psychological perspective that kind of people ruminate on negative information more, right? And kind of tend to think about it more and be more attracted to, they're more sticky thoughts, right? And so, yeah, I don't know that we can change the way in which we reward people with our own attention, right?
Yeah, it's true. I think that you're right. It's just a negative side of the deep psychology. So not something that we can just correct because it is so embedded in us, unfortunately, I suppose.
Right.
So I guess the obvious question here, and like I think we both know the answer to this, but I suppose let's get this out of the way. Why don't we want an entire team of high performers? Wouldn't that make sense if everyone's kicking ass on your team?
So what's interesting is, some of the work that I've done suggests that there is kind of a point at which there are diminishing returns to having the proportion of stars on the team be above, and it was in a healthcare setting and a banking context. We saw around in the mid 20%. And I actually, it was funny because in the Wall Street Journal, you can reply to the author, right? Luckily, they don't have a section at the bottom for comments because I would not, want to hear how brutal people were to me there. But I did get someone answer to me and said, that's a load of crap. I always just hire a bunch of stars and you blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, I'm not saying that's wrong, right? Of course, I understand, particularly when we're talking about executive teams, we want all those people to be stars. What we're talking about is just like run-of-the-mill teams that you're putting together as a manager, right? And I would suggest that as much as it might be this idea of kind of status infighting, like people vying for their own position that leads to less knowledge sharing, less trust, less cooperation when you have multiple stars on the team, I think it's probably just as much driven by this idea of kind of like a duplication of efforts, right? Like just kind of a not as much good being done because you have enough people there. You know what I mean? So doing good already. And when in terms of one of the things we talked about was in terms of the learning that can happen among your non-stars, I just feel like the returns start to get less, right? Once you have more. And you could argue that like one or two really good stars that are leading by example and that people really want to follow might be as good for the non-stars as, depending on how big the team is, of course, as, half the team being stars. And then they're kind of not even stars anymore, right? Because stardom is kind of a relative, assessment of where I am versus everyone else. So yeah, I think there's two different mechanisms that you might be able to argue. One is kind of this idea of status conflict that arises when you have too many stars. But, there are different ways you could even address that. If there are different functions that stars occupy, I would argue that you really don't have this kind of diminishing returns as much. So if you have like a cross-disciplinary, cross-functional team where you have stars in each of those different functions, I think that can be a great situation, right? And so this guy who's angry at me online, emailing me, I didn't email him back, of course, but what I would tell him is, look, if you're like in a small business or if you're in a team that people have really defined distinct roles, yeah, hire the star for all of it, right? And they'll want and get stuff done and be able to help each other to be even better and be a star team, right? But if have a bunch of sales reps or a bunch of, some people in a situation, at some point there's diminishing returns, at least the data would suggest, to having more stars on the team for the total output.
Yeah. That's the sales example is often what I sort of relate to in this is if everyone's trying to step on each other in order to climb to the top, right? Like the collaboration kind of goes out the window fairly quickly. Whereas if you have, a team of 8 people, one star, one sort of like fairly visionary and effective leader, and then, you usually end up with sort of the middle of the road people that are just sort of getting by and doing the things that are done. Like they have high accountability, but they're not necessarily striving for the next thing. And then you've got sort of a small cohort of the group, which is incredibly supportive and relies a lot on that social cohesiveness and collaboration and working with others. Like that to me is sort of the makeup of an all-star team in my mind.
Yep. Yeah. And you need that, right? You can't have people, you can't waste time. You need to be able to share information. You need to be able to trust each other. Particularly another element that really shapes whether or not the proportion of stars has diminishing returns is how interdependent they are as well, right? I mean, if they really need each other to get their job done, that makes it harder when you have people who aren't working together well, right? If they're all kind of individually doing their own thing, it probably isn't going to matter much. Hire all the stars you want, right? It shouldn't really be a big deal.
So, how should we think about maximizing the potential of the stars that we do identify in the team?
Well, I think helping them to recognize that they influence their peers and helping them. One of the things that I consult on with star employees is helping them to recognize that you can't just assume people are going to like you. In fact, you kind of are fighting an uphill battle when it comes to you being great around other people. You're going to be threatening to a lot of people. And so to the extent that you can help them to reduce that threatening aspect and help others see them more as an opportunity to work around, the better. And so a couple of things in that vein. I don't know if you want me to get into detail of this, but one of the things we talk about is showing what I would say some humility, right? And I'm not saying say you're not good when you are. I don't see that as humility. I see humility as kind of more of a quiet strength that shows and is honest about where you can still learn, and that is able to give credit where credit is due, and is somebody who is looking at themselves as still as a work in progress, right? And is able to outline when something happens and does it well. I'm not saying you need to avoid praise or avoid credit. What I'm saying is you give credit to all those around you that did well as well, right? And others put together and find out for themselves, yeah, we know that person is great, right? And they don't have to talk about it all the time, right?
Right.
The humility piece is important. I would also say there's a vulnerability piece that is important as well. And what I mean by that is somebody who's not afraid to kind of reveal their humanness, reveal their struggles, and maybe it's not even at work, right? Maybe you just are a little bit more real and bring your whole person to work. And at work, you're still amazing, but people around you are going to have a harder time kind of objectifying you as this person that I don't like, when I'm able to know who you are inside and outside of work and know that you're a person, that you have struggles, that you fought to get where you are, right? I have to respect that, right? That you paid a price, right? And a price that, frankly, me as the non-star, I'm not willing to pay, right? And so I respect it. And I say, good for you. I'm okay with that, right? Never trying to seek for any special privileges or credit that you don't deserve. That's something that just immediately turns people off, right? If you're looking for, and a lot of times people, one of my favorite organizational psychologists, Denise Rousseau, has a whole kind of program of research on idiosyncratic deals, meaning like, especially with stars, you get, oftentimes they'll make certain exceptions. You can work from home more than everyone else. You can, obviously you get paid more. You're able to have your own parking spot. We give you more vacation time. We give you this, we give you that. I think you need to be really careful about how transparent you are about those things as an organization. You don't necessarily want to hide it, but you don't necessarily need to throw it in people's faces.
Right.
Simply because people's inequity, there's a self-serving bias, right? And we tend to inflate our own inputs into whatever situation. And we tend to deflate others' inputs, right? So you're always going to be working against the fact that, that person, they aren't that input. They think they're greater. I do all this work and When in the end, usually it's kind of a market that decides the value of that person's human capital and mine. And having that conversation just kind of a conversation. So the extent to which you shouldn't flaunt any special treatment that you have. And if there is special treatment, explain why, right? Make sure that people's kind of sense of equity is really kind of clear and explained. One other thing that we've found, and this is kind of more nuanced, is that when there's a big age difference, that it actually is a lot easier for me to see them as an opportunity. So for instance, and this is another way, so I've one paper right now that looks at how stars kind of contribute to value in organizations differently at different career stages. Oftentimes, their individual contributing is at their height when they're younger, in their earlier phase. And later on, they are often more predisposed to think about their legacy and invest in others. And organizations, if they can kind of capitalize on this, I think they can see it as something that they can use that to their advantage, right? And so let me take a step back and talk about why someone who's older, an older star, is less threatening. Well, if you think about it in terms of my ability to attain that person's kind of status or productivity, I can because I have 10, 20 years to do it, right? And so I see them as someone I would love to be in the future. It's much more threatening when I see somebody who is like my age, who is at my career stage, killing it. It's like, I can't reach them.
Right.
It's too late for me, right? And so that age difference, this idea of older stars, pairing them kind of strategically with younger hopefuls, right, is another way to kind of capitalize on these peer spillovers again, which is what I'm interested in, is how we get them to have these peer spillovers. Not only are they more able, they have more social kind of capital, they have more reputational capital, they also are more motivated to do so. They care about their legacy at this point. They've already made their millions. Now they want to make other people millionaires, right? And so that's, this idea that they can kind of symbolically achieve immortality through their legacy, right? Through instilling their beliefs, their norms, their technical kind of, the way they do the work, right? Instill that in their own kind of progeny, right? It goes back to kind of child development. Eric Erickson, he was the one who kind of did this whole idea of generativity, right? Mm-hmm. But that's been applied at work, and especially with stars who kind of they identify so heavily with their careers that when the death of that comes, right? When they're looking at their retirement, they're starting to think, well, how can I? They don't think about it, but the process becomes like, how do I achieve immortality? Well, I instill my image in the next generation, right? And so firms should capitalize on that. And, it's interesting because a lot of times firms they'll hire somebody and they'll hire an older star, or they'll look at an older star and they'll be like, they haven't done anything, they're not producing like they used to. We're not going to buy it. It's like, well, you shouldn't be looking for that. And fine, don't do it if that's what you're looking for. Look for somebody young and hungry, looking to prove, looking to still hit at their prime. But you shouldn't overlook those who, might intrinsically, kind of their own choice, want to invest in the next generation, put them in places, make them visible, make them mentors. And, I think it's an important way to utilize and make that peer spillover more salient.
Yeah, I think more organizations would benefit from either formal or informal mentorships like this. I've seen this effect time and time again. I think you're right. Like, the peer is absolutely more threatening, but someone that they sort of recognize as older, I guess they're often a little less boisterous about it too. Like, it's a quiet confidence when in an older generation. Not always the case, but I find that's often the case. Yeah, it comes with that level of maturity. And I've seen a lot of young stars rise up under the wing of someone older who sort of recognize, like, they kind of remind me of me when I was younger and I was a hard charger. And I'll teach this kid a couple of things, basically, right?
Yeah, no, and that's so so important. We talk about kind of how to identify stars. Are stars made, or are they identified? And I would argue that most people who do end up achieving stardom, as I define them, have people in their lives like this. Professional mentors that have cultivated them. And, it's amazing. Even like, so take a look at sports, the amount of, NBA players who had a parent who played in the NBA is non-trivial, right? I mean, and so what I mean by that is like, people need to be taught, right? There are a lot of forces working against high performers to make it so they don't achieve stardom. And so having someone else who they respect saying, whoa, you got to stop flaunting this, right? Or you need to take a step back. You need to learn still from others. You need to be more humble. You need to, etc. Having someone to help them to realize, no, this is the long game, right? Of building a reputation that is respected, right? It's one thing to be a top, performer 1 year, but how many of those people burn out, right? A ton of them, right? It's another thing to slowly build up a coalition of not only individual productivity, but a network of people supporting you who want you to win, right? And who cheer for you, even though you're the one getting the benefit and not them, right? So learning how to have that type of reputation is something that people don't just fall into naturally, right? There's usually a lot of coaching.
One other thing that sort of occurs to me as we're talking about this is I feel like so much of this is subliminal psychology that is applicable both in personal and professional life. But I feel like that's often not talked about or recognized as these things are somewhat universally applicable. What's your thought on that? Like, all of the sort of the psychological basis, like the tribalism, the ego, all of those things that seem to sort of play such a huge weight in interpersonal relationships and sort of the makeup of the team and how people work together. But I feel like there's maybe either a reticence to talk about it or to at least sort of a non-recognition of how much these things really influence our day-to-day work.
I mean, that's literally my world, right? As a behavioral scientist, large part of my job, I love interacting, with the media and with practice, but most of my job, what I'm paid to do is get in these dogfights with other researchers, with psychologists, right? And try and publish in peer-reviewed articles, peer-reviewed journals. And so I deeply believe that it is psychology and sociology and anthropology that leads to when someone's a good leader, when someone's a good performer, when someone's a good team member, all of those things. I agree with you that the science behind it is not often appreciated. I think I think my field can take some responsibility for it. I think oftentimes we are not incentivized to do what we're doing right now and hop on a podcast. And so I think we need to do better at translating it as well, right? We need to do better at recognizing the language differences and the incentives that are out there in the world of work, rather than just the academic setting, which we tend to kind of isolate ourselves in probably too much. And so there are some people doing really well, like everyone knows Adam Grant, et cetera, people like that. These people who are, I mean, he is a legitimate scientist, right? But he's also translating it for the public, and doing a great job at it. So I have a lot of respect for people who kind of do both. But you're right. I think science is slow. We use sometimes esoteric language, and there's a good reason for that from our perspective. And we're often careful to make statements, right? Because we're trained and taught to be so hesitant. And, this whole idea that, a theory is only true until it's proven false. And so we just don't like to make too many claims. And so that doesn't often, jive super well with managers who want answers now and they want certainty, right? And they want it to happen fast because that's the world they live in. And so I think there is a bit of a divide. But with that said, Todd, I think there is just also a lot to learn, right? And that's why I think it's so fun to tackle issues that are really important to managers.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like the access and the visibility and the translation of the research to the public, I think is an important aspect. But my question was actually not necessarily kind of saying, where are you guys at on this? I feel like like I said, it's a hesitance or a non-recognition for sort of the normal people about what are the realities that they see in front of them. And a good example that I'll maybe run past you, this is outside sort of the what we're talking about here, but I think you'll probably have some experience with this or at least have some thoughts on it, is one of the things that I often ask people when I start consulting with them is what is your org chart? Can you show me your org chart? And small business quite often doesn't have one. And the answer I'm often posed with is, well, it's a flat organization. Like, I don't see that as necessary. I'm like, really? Like, I'm not talking about hierarchy from command and control perspective. I'm saying that humans are still somewhat tribal, and they naturally and somewhat subliminally want to look up and understand who is their leader, like who are they following. And if there's no recognition or formality of that, I find it gets a little messy. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So a couple different things. One, to this idea that people often look towards convention, right? Things that work almost universally and think it doesn't apply here, right? I think that's something that people kind of wear that as a badge of honor. We're non-conventional, right? And that's maybe even part of our culture and part of our ability to feel unique, right? And which is important, right? For a business. But at the same time, I think what businesses need to do is just recognize that, like, you can't reinvent the wheel. Those things exist for a reason, and you need to know why you're not using them, right? And try out in your mind using it, and then change it as needed. But don't just assume you don't need it, right? Because it ends up being just kind of silly. And it's amazing how many people, particularly in the small business realm, could benefit, my goodness, from just some pretty rudimentary kind of skills and thoughts. So yeah, no, I see what you're saying there.
Yeah. And some of this, like I said, is like what I'm hinging this on is like, this is deep-seated psychology. This is not something like you may have a different culture, but humans are humans and still will behave that way. And that's what I'm sort of getting at here is I think a lot of the important research that you guys are doing are identifying and codifying the things that psychology has already said. We recognize how they function within a business context. And now it's reapplied knowledge in a lot of ways. And it's still incredibly useful. But why isn't everyone else attaching to this and saying, like, this is important for my business as important as strategy and marketing, right? Like around how the humans function in inside this building, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, no, and I would agree. I built my life's work around it for sure. And so no, I get that. The hard thing is, and this is what, teaching, especially, master students, a lot of times I think the MBA is centered around an economics kind of framework,
Yep.
right? And for good reason, right? And I think the mindset of economics is really about markets. It's about value. It's about competition. And it's about understanding a landscape and how you can find your niche in that landscape, right? There is behavior economics that steals ideas from psychology, and that's fine. But you're right. I think the business training that we have right now, we teach a class on leadership, and most, not all, but many people in that class are like, these are just soft skills. Like, you either have them or you don't, right?
Right.
Like, you can't really teach them. And that's patently false, right? I mean, I think anybody, again, I've said this before, anybody who rises to this top in leadership of organizations takes them very seriously, right? Like, they take all of the psychology involved in being a leader, being a good team member, being, doing your role. They take it very, very seriously, and they put time into it. Being a leader is not natural. No one's just great. They've put in a ton of time and work and paid attention to, the evidence and looked at role models who have done that as well. So I think you're right. Of course, I mean, you're preaching to the chorus.
Sure.
I sure believe that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Right on. Well, this has been really fascinating, Matt. I appreciate your time and applaud the work that you're doing. I think this, as I said, I think this stuff is incredibly important and I think deserves wide recognition for its impacts on business and growth of business and just making people work better together, whether or not they're a star performer or not, right?
Absolutely. Hey, thank you, Todd. Thanks for having me on.
Part of the MSP Radio Network.